Every week I sit down to write a sermon. I usually start on Sundays, and this week, every day I sat down to write a sermon, I wrote a different sermon. Every week was a different topic in my mind. And even though I rarely tell you the name of my sermon, it's an exercise that I often do in order to make sure that my comments are focused. So let me tell you some of the names of the sermons that I found throughout this week. The first was, "This is not a time for nuance or equivocation." As the war broke out in Israel, I began a sermon about moral clarity at this time. And while we often talk about the Middle East as a very nuanced and challenging region of the world, I felt that early in this week there was a call for moral clarity. And then on Tuesday, the sermon became "The Arch of History Bends Towards Justice," in the hopes that I could write a sermon that would bring hope to the world that good will triumph over evil. And then, as many of us already so early on in the week became tired and exhausted from lack of sleep, I wrote a very angry sermon called "I Know Who to Blame." It was a sermon about holding those who are responsible accountable for the horror. And then I wrote a sermon as the despair set in, entitled "This is Too Much for Me to Bear." This was a sermon about how this singular moment in our history left me feeling completely inadequate and shattered. And then I rested on a sermon later in the week called "Love Will Find a Way." This was supposed to be a sermon of hope, of light in the face of darkness, about love overcoming hatred. And I think I could have given each and every one of those sermons today. Each of those sermons is really just one piece of the puzzle. That is the complexity of human emotion when faced with the incomprehensible. Each of these sermons aptly described the highs and lows of the defiance and the sadness, the resilience and the suffering that we're all feeling all at the same time. When I arrived at today's sermon, though, it just made sense. It was at 12:30, just after midnight on Thursday. And so this sermon today is called "Living in the Not Knowing." Quietly, I'll admit to the fact that I have been keeping score all week long. How many deaths? How many have they suffered? How many have we? How many rockets were launched into Israel, and how many were intercepted by the Iron Dome missile defense system? How many drone attacks and how many airstrikes? Then, after I grew tired of that comparison, I started tracking news coverage. How many times has the phrase "proportionate response" been said? Who came out in support of Israel and who was silent? Whose support was full-throated and whose was an equivocation? Which institutions ran to defend Israel and which denounced Israel? Which politicians used this moment to grandstand, and which are true friends of the state of Israel, working hard to provide the actual assistance that Israel needs? What was each statement saying, and what was missing from each statement? Which statements were tone deaf and we're simply checking a box in which we're truly sincere. And then I started from the top of the list again, only to realize that keeping score is a terrible coping mechanism. And it doesn't do anybody any good. So I did what I often do. I looked to our sacred and ancient texts to break that circular thinking. The story we read this morning, the story of Bereishit, of the creation of the world, starts out by tricking us. It tricks us into thinking that God had taken from the absolute chaos and created order. It started by tricking us into thinking that God had created a perfect world, only to realize that even before we finished the first sentence, God started to rethink God's plan. And from the creation of a second human, it's clear that the people are going to do whatever they want, and nothing ever goes according to God's plan when human beings are involved. So the first story, they eat from the fruit against God's wishes. And then Cain kills Abel in a cycle of violence that still exists today because the adventure of evil had been forced to wander the earth. That, you know, of course, was Cain's punishment. Cain, who tricked his brother into coming close and then ruthlessly killed him. His punishment was to wander the earth. Cain becomes the embodiment of evil that now wanders the earth. The kind that sneaks up on you when you're not looking. The kind of evil that soaks the ground with blood. But the lesson is much deeper and way more heinous than that simple act of Cain killing Abel. But the story is instructive. It is a 10-verse story with 5 significant sentences. Cain kills Abel. Vayomer Kayin el hevel achiv, vayakam Kayin el hevel achiv ve'argeu. Cain said, "Come here, I want to talk to you." And then he killed him. Cain said to his brother when they were in the field, "Come on over, we'll talk." And then under surprise attack, he kills him. Cain responds to God's call. "Where is Hevel, your brother? Where is Abel, your brother?" And he says, "Hashomer achi anochi." Am I my brother's keeper? As if the entirety of the entire Torah is suggesting that in fact we are each other's brother's keepers. God presses Cain. "Ma'asita, what did you do?" "Demei achicha tzoakim alai min adama." What have you done? Your brother's blood calls to me from the earth. And then God says, you'll be punished. Not with further bloodshed, but that you will be forced to walk the earth. Navanati ba'aretz. You will wander and wander without purpose, without direction. And Cain says, God, the punishment's disproportionate. Vayomer Cain el Adonai, gadol avoni minso. God, the punishment you have given me, that I'll have to live with my actions, is far too hard for me to bear. God says, from this moment, you will be ruthless. And they became ruthless. Forced to wander the earth. Evil is forced to walk the earth, only to find its next place to live, and we have found it this week. Absolute barbaric evil. I'm reminded, of course, of the story of Golda Meir, who was talking to a young senator at the time from Delaware. It was amidst the Yom Kippur War. Almost 50 years ago to the day. I paraphrase. The good has no choice but to win out over evil. What she actually said is the Jewish people have to survive because we have nowhere else to go. We saw this week the bloodiest day in Jewish history since the end of the World War II and the Holocaust. So we wait and watch from afar. We donate and we keep track of family and friends in Israel. We keep in touch with people here in our community and across the country who have family and friends in Israel. We gather for prayer. We make personal requests of God in the quiet moments we have when we finally turn off the news. We distract ourselves. And then, at least for me, start it all over again. Donating, keeping track of family and friends in Israel, reaching out to keep in touch with those in our community who are suffering alongside me. I gather for prayer. I make personal requests of God in the quiet moments when I finally turn off the news, and then I start all over again. We're in a liminal moment, a transitional moment. And just like when we were babies, we needed a transitional object. For the Jews, that has always been born of our tradition that says, as Barry Weiss, a former New York Times columnist, reported this week, we hold on to life when they hold on to death. We pursue life while they pursue death. This is a war of civilization against barbarism. Because we hold on to life, we say it every week, Eitz Chaim hi l'machazikim ba. It is a tree of life to those who hold fast to it. It's a tree of life, not a tree of death. Almighty God, Lord of the living and the dead, the hearts of your children are heavy with grief. I pray, give them comfort. We're overcome by pain and tears. Help us to remember the triumph and the joy of the life of our people, be they little children or grown adults who have already suffered the terrors of the Holocaust. We're overwhelmed by loss. Oh Lord, help us to treasure what is ours because we continue to live. We continue to live. Am Yisrael Chai. Help us to meet grief with courage, to confront the angel of death with life. When despair threatens, when faith falters, God, sustain us all. You're our refuge, our strength, our ever-present help. The cantor just announced the new month of Mar Cheshvan. It's the only month that we refer to as Mar, bitter. It's because our tradition shows there are no holidays in this month. It's my sincere and complete belief that in the next month, when we stand here on Shabbat morning and announce the next month, that we'll have greater peace, that there will be no more violence, that our children will be returned home, that the war will stop, the suffering will cease. But until that moment, there is one thing we can do. Hold each other in the darkness and take it one day at a time. Shabbat Shalom. We continue with Musaf, page 184. Please rise.